Legislature's back in session. Before we recessed, there were two amendments being proffered by the Vice Speaker and Senator Nicholas. Has everybody received the amendments? Anybody wish to speak? Any senator wish to speak on the amendments? Do you wish to, Madam Vice Speaker?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I think this is a good amendment to the amendment. It narrows down the scope of what they need to report and lets them report only really the impact of this bill. What would the impact of this bill be on procurement and on competition, and allows small businesses to easily see what small purchases have been made that month. And I think that's the only way. It's going to be someplace, and hopefully it's temporary, and hopefully GSA will be able to put this up on their website eventually when all those things are available on their website. They're just not available right now. But ideally, when the small businesses can see immediately what's been the businesses that occurred that month, they will know whether they've been excluded from the competition or not, and the process will take its regular course. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much. Any other senator? Any objection to the amendment? On the main motion? On the main motion. On the main motion? If not, Senator Morrison, you're welcome to close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to first thank all colleagues for sharing their concerns and regarding Bill 49. I do want to point out, Mr. Speaker, that these thresholds were established in 1980, and I just want to make it very clear that since then there has been no mechanisms or has been no policy set in place to adjust these thresholds. But I did mention earlier that in the previous legislature that there was a more comprehensive procurement reform that was there to address specifically, we extracted out just the small purchases. Actually, that was Bill 162-33, and actually the thresholds were set at 30,000, and construction was set at 100,000. So I just want to say that this has been consistent with the previous legislations that many of us were a part of. And I just want to point out that I think many of us, if you look at the voting sheet, supported those thresholds. Actually, it was again pointed out at 30,000, and there was no concerns at that time. I do want to note that we made it clear on during the public hearing that, you know, we're looking at a lot of these things that we're addressing that were established in the late 70s, early 80s, and you know, we made it clear for the agencies that it wouldn't take a senator or anybody to go out and meet with these agencies to find out exactly what their challenges are. And, you know, there should be mechanism in place within their control to look at these things and not wait 30 years to make these adjustments to, for example, these thresholds. And I want to ensure that, you know, this was a result of, I know the chairman working in the past with the chief procurement and hearing some of the agency's challenges and meeting with some of these agencies to see where we can assist on. And it was just been a consistent theme with starting with GSA, GORA, DPW, actually even recently, or again even the previous term when we were dealing with the crime lab, a lot of issues, concerns were brought up when they're addressing the crime lab, trying to work with the thresholds of 15,000 to address an immediate concern of the crime lab. I'm not sure if you all recall that, but they did mention that because the threshold, my understanding was 15,000, they had to kind of break into some parts, some of their projects, the crime lab, to get that concern addressed immediately. But again, this is consistent with the efforts of the previous legislature. I thank the chairman for all his work his team has lent to our office to get this measure through or get it to the floor. So without any objections, or if there's no objections, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to add Senator Tom Atta as a co-sponsor of Bill 49. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. On the co-sponsorship, any objection? Hearing none. On the motion to send the bill down to the voting file, any objection? Hearing none. Senator Tom Atta, you recognized on Bill 106?
Bill 105.
105.
Yes. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I move to accept Bill 105-34 COR as amended by the Committee on Environment, Agriculture, Land, and Procurement Reform. Well, I guess we need to accept that, or...
On the motion to accept, does everybody have theirs? Or is it just me that's missing theirs? 105?
Yes, 105.
Does anybody have
Yeah, the Bill 105 as amended by the Committee on Environment, Land, Agriculture, and Procurement Reform.
On the motion to accept, any objection? You're recognized.
So I move to place Bill 105-34 as amended by the Committee on Environment, Land, Agriculture, and Procurement Reform for the third reading, and I would like to discuss it.
Any objection? Hearing none.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, Bill 105-34 is an act to rescind the administrative jurisdiction of approximately 3.5 acres of Lot 7054-R5 in the municipality of Chigo, and passed earlier was a aerial map that was passed to each desk, which shows you where these lots are, and I'll discuss it a little bit. And the administrative the bill proposes to grant the administrative jurisdiction of this piece of property to the Chief of Police. To basically take with the administrative jurisdiction of the same. Now, some of you may be looking at this and you're saying, then we did just address this last legislature where we identified a piece of land in that area for the Guam Police Department, and you are correct, for those of you who have noticed that. So in this aerial map that has been passed out to you, you'll see up to the top of the page an area that's shaped like a triangle, and it's annotated there, it's designated as GPD Original Site Lot 7054-1, and that is an area consisting of 2 acres. But when you actually take a look at that property, the developable area is actually less than 2 acres. And so the committee went and did further research and found that just on the other side, below the Jigo Gym and just south of where the GPA power plant is an area, a lot lot 7054-R5. And that's an area that consists of approximately 12 acres. And this is a piece of property that was set aside in Public Law 22-18. But when it was set aside, out of the 12 acres, it said that 8.5 of that will go to the Chamorro Land Trust Commission. The other 3.5 acres will stay under the jurisdiction of the Department of Land Management. So it is that 3.5 acres that we are now going to turn over to the Guam Police Department so that then they actually have a larger piece of property to be able to build their police facilities, such as the evidence locker, and there's enough area in there to store the impounded vehicles and possibly whatever else they can put in there. Now, the only problem, of course, is that when the law set aside that 12 acres, it was what we would call an undivided interest. It didn't really say that the frontage was the 3.5 acres that belonged to land management and the backside belonged to the Chamorro Land Trust. It just says, here's 12 acres, 3 of that belongs to land management, and the other 8.5 belongs to CLTC. So what the bill does is it basically then carves out 3.5 acres that will be given to the Guam Police Department, and the remaining 8.5 acres will stay with the Chamorro Land Trust inventory. The bill does not say GPD gets the front and Chamorro Land Trust gets the back piece. Instead, the bill says that it will be left for the department trying to find a map designated. On page 2, line 24, it says the location of the 3.5 acre portion shall be at the discretion of the Chief of Police. So if the Chief of Police feels that really the backside of that lot 7054-R5 suits their needs better, then they would get 3.5 acres on the backside, and the frontage will be left with the Chamorro Land Trust Commission. But I think it's best to just leave it with the executive branch, let them sort that out in the bigger scheme of things, because we do know that in lot 7054, Chamorro Land Trust has actually identified 8.5 acres in there as commercial property. So basically that's what Bill 105 does. Now, again, with that, it assures GPD 3.5 acres of property to build their facilities on, versus what we had originally given them, which was really less than 2 acres of developable property. Mr. Speaker, I would ask, I guess time is also running on this. GPD has I believe a $1.2 million grant with which to build their facility. But before they can access that, they need to have site control of where they're going to build their facility, and this money will expire, I believe, in about 12 to 18 months. So it's imperative that we get moving on this. Now, I'm sure that the question's going to come up. So then what's going to happen to that property that was in another law just recently given to GPD? Well, that is a matter that will have to be addressed in a separate bill, and we're going to keep Bill 105 to just one land transaction so that we can give GPD developable property for them to build their facilities. And actually this property would be very easy to build on because it's a nice flat piece versus the one up north there, which is kind of hills and dells. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I certainly will ask my colleagues to support Bill 105. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. On the main motion, Bill 105, Senator Arkin, did you put your hand up?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the sponsor of the legislation. Mr. Speaker, I certainly stand in support of the proposed measure. I just have a few questions with regards to the overall presentation by the sponsor of the legislation. Because, Mr. Speaker, I have a handout in front of me, Bill 105 handout, and it delineates the frontal portion for GPD. So, unless, just looking at the map, unless there's clarification, because it shows a line, a bifurcation of the 3.5 acres, which is adjacent to the roadway, Route 1, and then the remaining balance of 8.5. So I'm trying to understand, I know that there's a provision that the sponsor mentioned, that the location of the 3.5 acre portion shall be at the discretion of the Chief of Police, but then I'm looking at a map that says approximate boundary line between GPD and CLTC portions, and the frontal portion is approximately 3.5 acres. So if I can just get clarification on that, Mr. Speaker, and then I do have a couple of follow-up inquiries.
Senator, do you yield?
Mr. Speaker, so the designation was made there for illustration purposes. So the committee, actually the office staff, had taken a look at the way this property is configured. And if we were going to carve out 3.5 acres, it's about where it is currently delineated. But that's only for illustration purposes. This aerial map is not to be attached to the bill, so it doesn't bind that GPD. What will bind is that the Chief of Police will have the discretion as to whether he picks the front or the back.
Thank you very much to the sponsor of the legislation. I have a few others, if I may also respond, Mr. Speaker. The Section 4, it says exemption from appraisals. I do understand that the code requires that anything that's placed, any measure that's placed in third reading necessitates an appraisal. But then there's also the standing rules that restricts any legislation from being placed in the third reading. So, Mr. Speaker, if I can ask the sponsor if language pursuant and referencing the standing rules also be incorporated in there, so that in fact, we don't disregard the legislative standing rules. And I'm sure that the sponsor can work with our legal counsel with regards to that, because that was an issue that was brought up about 2 months ago. So the other question I have, Mr. Speaker, is as I read Section 5, it says rezoning from agricultural zone to light industrial zone. And the way it reads is the Guam Police Department, pursuant to this act, is hereby rezoned, or is, looking at the entire language, I'm sorry, let me read it so that our people would understand the nature of the question. It reads, rezoning from agricultural zone to light industrial zone, M1, that 3.5 portion of lot number 7054-R5, that is to be placed under the administrative jurisdiction of the Office of the Chief of Police, Guam Police Department, pursuant to this act, is hereby rezoned from agriculture zone A to light industrial zone M1 for a public facility. And then, Mr. Speaker, just for clarification purposes, the subsequent section reads, agricultural impact statement required pursuant to 21 GCA and subsection 61637, the Director of the Department of Agriculture shall submit an agricultural impact statement regarding lot 7054R5, which is exactly the lot we're referencing here, to the Land Use Commission before said lot is rezoned. So in one section, Section 5, it says, pursuant to this act is hereby rezoned from A to M1, and then the subsequent section reads, an agricultural impact statement has to be submitted on this very same lot to the Land Use Commission before said lot is rezoned. So I believe that these two provisions, Mr. Speaker, and the sponsor of the legislation really has to be reconciled so that it's clear whether in fact we are rezoning it by virtue of this measure, or are we going to have it rezoned upon the submission of the agricultural impact statement based on Section 6. So just some points of concern with regards to how this is being presented, and I just wanted to make sure that we deconflict any issues that may arise during the course of the consideration of this. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Senator, do you wish to address both of those? Thank you.
Sure. Mr. Speaker, let me start with the easier one, and that's on Section 6 regarding the requirement for the agricultural impact statement. First of all, when we were having a public hearing on this, the director of the Department of Agriculture was sitting in the audience, and I specifically read that particular section of the bill that the agricultural impact statement that comes from his department is going to be essential. And I asked him directly, I said, will you be able to get this report ready? Yes, no problem. Got it. On the way. Call back again this morning to follow up. So you know, that's very bothersome. Now the second part is that, and I guess the answer to that, and certainly the gentleman from Jonia is very correct. The law says, you know, 21 GCS says that the Department of Agriculture shall submit an agricultural impact statement. And maybe the answer to that, what he brings up, is that I'm going to put in there on line 10 in the front, notwithstanding any other legislation or whatever, because we're not going to have, I don't think it's for one, this is not the first time the Department of Agriculture doesn't come through in a timely manner for this agricultural impact statement. Secondly, the area that we're looking at, it hasn't been an agricultural area, so it isn't as if we're taking out agricultural land out of the inventory. I mean, it's been used for industrial activities for the longest time, and it's not going to return back to be an agricultural piece of property. So to that, you know, my suggestion would be either just strike out Section 6, or we can just put in there, notwithstanding. Maybe the easiest thing is just, I move to strike Section 6.
There is a motion to strike Section 6. On that amendment, Senator Espaldon.
I respect what the mover of the amendment is trying to do. However, even by striking Section 6 does not dispense of the requirement pursuant to 21 GCA, and so I'm not sure that would be the solution. And I think that might be the problem here. I think perhaps in this situation, perhaps a notwithstanding clause would probably be more appropriate, because just by striking it does not do away with the requirement that's promulgated under Title 21, Section 61637.
Thank you, Senator Espaldon.
So actually then, the amendment would be to strike Section 6, and then we would have to put a notwithstanding language in Section 5 there, that notwithstanding 21 GCA 61637. Maybe we need to take a recess there, but we're going to need to make that massaging. We do have the we do need to address that agricultural impact statement, and then of course there was still that Section 4 that needs to be responded to, and the response to Section 4 about why are we exempting the appraisals, and that the language there on line 4, page 3 says does not apply to this act, is because Why do we really need? Okay. So the law says you need it. So put another notwithstanding section in there, language, but we're going from, it's a piece of property from Department of Land Management that's going to be given over to it's staying within the government. And again, we've had this discussion, you know, appraisers are not out there lining up at the door waiting to do the service. So points are, I was hoping that by now we would have gotten the agricultural impact statement. I see that quite frankly, I cannot depend on the Department of Agriculture. They have fallen short in the past. They are falling short right now again. And then insofar as the appraisals is concerned, so maybe at this point it'd be good to just take a couple of minutes recess.
Let's take a short recess.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And again, in response to the points that were raised by the gentleman from Jonia, which were very valid points, we have amendments that have been passed out, and I would like to take each amendment one at a time. So the first amendment you will see there is to amend on page 3, section 4, lines 3 and 4, such that then with the issue of appraisals, the amendment is that 2 GCA 2107B and section 6.04C1 of the 34th Guam Legislature Standing Rules or any other provision of law, rule, or regulation relative to land appraisals shall not apply to this act. And I think that that exemption is justified from the standpoint that the property that we are providing to the Guam Police Department, we're basically really just changing jurisdiction. It is not coming out of the government of Guam or from somebody else's inventory. So it's property that is under the jurisdiction of the Department of Land Management. We are simply transferring that jurisdiction over to the Guam Police Department, and so I think that can justify the exemption from the appraisals. So I ask that my colleagues consider that.
On this First Amendment, any senator wish to be heard? On this First Amendment, on lines 3 and 4, page 3, exempting the appraisals. Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm just rising for clarification. The way the title is written, it's to change the administrative jurisdiction. Changing administrative jurisdiction is not the same as a transfer. And I believe we covered this in a previous session. And so I believe that the exemption language for appraisals would not be necessary because we're not transferring the property. And I believe, if memory serves me correctly, the two appraisals will be necessary for a taking, a transfer, a purchase, or a lease. And so since we're simply changing administrative jurisdiction and we're not necessarily transferring title, I do not believe that the exemption from appraisals is necessary on the statute. And the only reason why I rise for that is because I would prefer that we don't have the language at all if it's not necessary, then put language in there exempting it from that, because I don't want to set a precedent that we're interested in exempting standing rule or public law. But that being said, I believe that the way that the author has originally crafted this bill, changing administrative jurisdiction, is sufficient to not require 2 GCA section 2107B from coming into effect.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard on the amendment? Madam Vice Speaker,
I would just like clarification from legal if that's correct interpretation of the administrative jurisdiction. And also, for me, this bill doesn't merely transfer jurisdiction from Department of Land Management. It actually, we are dividing a lot that in part belongs to the Chamorro Land Trust. So it's in their inventory. And in fact, they had designated this part for commercial lease. So it's one of those things where, you know, perhaps Chamorro Land Trust should have seen an appraisal before they agreed. If they agreed, I mean, I'm going to speak on the bill. I'm not think they necessarily agreed, but because if they're giving up property from their inventory, they should know what is the value of that property before they agree to some lesser valued property in exchange. And
Point
this
of
is really
information,
just,
Mr. Speaker.
they're drawing the line here, so I just think it might still be relevant. But I would like clarification on that amendment. Or it's not an amendment, I guess. He was raising a point of order or something.
No, it's an amendment that's being proffered.
No, but the previous speaker
Yes.
had said that it's not necessary.
We'll take a short recess and consult with legal counsel. We back on? We're back in order. Senator Ada?
So after consulting with legal counsel, his advice is to stay with the language, and I don't believe an objection was raised. I believe a concern was registered, but an objection wasn't raised. And so certainly to leave Section 4 in with the amendments as proffered certainly does not take away from anything.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard on the amendment? On the amendment, any other senator wish to be heard? Any objection to the amendment? Any objection to the amendment? Hearing none.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to address the second concern that was raised by the gentleman from Jonya. And that's on, again, page 3, addressing Section 5. The amendment that I would like to make is that on line 6, and everybody has a copy of this, to insert the phrase, notwithstanding 21 GCA, section 61637, or any other provision of law or rule or regulation, that the 3.5 acre portion of lot 7054-R5 that is to be placed is hereby rezoned from agricultural zone A to light industrial M1 for a public facility. So the amendment that's being made is inserting the notwithstanding phrase. And what's going to follow right after this is then to delete section 6, which is the section 6 has to do with the agricultural impacts statement, and that's what we are exempt.
Let's take them one by one.
Okay.
On the First Amendment, on line 6.
Correct.
The notwithstanding provision. Any senator wish to be heard? Senator Sniffers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I just rise to the concern. When you pull up the committee report on this bill and you review the committee report checklist that was prepared by the current chair of the Committee on Rules, it was checked off that these components for the filing of the committee report were inadequate, and yet the committee report was allowed to be filed for the bill. And so I wanted to rise and raise that concern, because the reason why these components were put into this checklist is because these are existing laws. These are existing laws with respect to how we handle land transactions, and granted they can be cumbersome, but they exist. This language would be sufficient for us to bypass the need for there to be a agricultural report from the Department of Agriculture with respect to a rezoning of an agriculturally zoned property into something different. The reason why this law is on the books is because when we rezone properties, you typically go through the Land Use Commission and get a rezoning, and it goes through all the scrutiny that requires in order for it to be determined whether or not it's something that would be good for the community. But we do have the power in this body to rezone through statute, which is what will be happening as part of this bill. And granted, while we may have an understanding that this property that's being rezoned isn't necessarily agricultural, I'm concerned just about the precedents, Mr. Speaker, because the reason why we require the agricultural report for rezoning of property that is right now zoned agricultural is because we don't want to industrialize and potentially cause adverse impacts on the agricultural usage of property. You don't want to cause some kind of facility to be built that might leach out into, farmland or whatever. And so I rise because I don't think that we should be moving forward measures that do not conform under their original committee report. And the reason why that's important to bring up is because then we can go back, we can bring in, agriculture, we can ask them why they're not submitting their report, or we can somehow work towards getting it and then put all those issues to bed. Because granted, this might not be so much of an issue of this particular legislation, it may be with future ones. And I'm just not comfortable with us taking this step. I wasn't comfortable with the previous action either so much, and I wanted to again just rise and register the objection and also raise the official concern that I think that the committee needs to hold firm to the checklist, and if there's something on there that doesn't check off, go back to the committee of jurisdiction and say, hey, can you just fulfill this one requirement, because technically this is what the law requires. So I wanted to rise and raise that, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, and that is an objection. Well, I think that's what I heard, an objection and a concern. So I just wanted to make that clear. Any other senator wish to be heard on the amendment? Anybody else wish to be heard on the amendment? Go ahead.
I guess I'm also rising in objection to the amendment because the amendment says, or any other provision of law or rule or regulation, and I didn't want to waive what is required in Section 3 of the bill, which is a land zoning report, which is required by another law. And so I don't want that to be waived. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. There's been an objection raised. Any other senator wish to be heard? Any other senator wish to be heard? There is an objection to the amendment. All those, where are the two senators? We'll take a short recess. All right, we're back on. There's been an objection. All those in favor of the amendment proffered by Senator Tom Atta, please indicate by raising your hand. Motion passes. Senator Atta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the final amendment that I have, again, is on page 3. That's regarding Section 6, and the amendment is to delete Section 6 in its entirety.
On the motion by Senator Atta to delete Section 6, any senator wish to be heard? Any objection? There's been an objection raised. All those in favor of the amendment, please indicate by raising your hands. Motion passes. Senator Atta, do you have any other amendments you'd wish to make?
None, Mr. Speaker.
On the main motion, any senator wish to be heard on the bill? On the main motion. If not, oh wait, Senator, Madam Vice Speaker, you wish to speak? Madam Vice Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am definitely in support of carving out a piece of property for GPD. I went to all the hearings and listened to their need and their proposal. I just think that this particular property, it's complicated. It was supposed to be divvied up with CLTC, so this bill is dividing it at the discretion of the Chief of Police. And so when you look at the properties overall, and if you look at it from the perspective of CLTC, which is supposed to be acting as trustee over the properties and their inventory, it's possible they're going to end up with a portion of the property that they are no longer able to use as they intended, either for residential, agricultural, or commercial lease, because they might end up with the property that's being used as a bus depot right now, or part of it at least is being used like that. So anyways, they had, they did not appear at the hearing, but they did submit testimony which raises some concerns, and I just feel like I would like these to be resolved. One of them is, the first that I pointed out was that they would like to retain the property fronting Marine Corps Drive, Route 1. And GPD is building an evidence storage unit, and I don't think it was part of the record that they required a Route 1 frontage. This bill is different than the previous bill, giving them property for the evidence storage, wherein it doesn't restrict them from placing the, what do they call it? The vehicle impound lot on the same piece of property. I had assumed that that was a restriction when we were giving them 7054-1 because we did not want that impound lot up on Marine Drive. So that was one of my questions. And GPD, because CLTC points it out, I'd raise that concern. If you look at the letter from Department of Land Management, they actually are speaking on behalf of CLTC here. They request the following: that they would get the Route 1 frontage, and that they, and I also think that makes sense, because if we're giving from one executive branch to another, then we're transferring administrative jurisdiction. But if transferring out of the Chamorro Land Trust inventory to an executive branch agency, then it's different. The second concern that's brought up in the Department of Land Management's letter is that 7054-1, they say if you give this frontage property to GPD, then they are asking that they be given 7054-1. And I'm assuming they don't explain it all the way, but because part of the property that they would be given is being used by DPW for the bus depot, bus operations. And they say that this lot that's being used by DPW was originally reserved for GPD. Wait, no. No, I guess it's 7054-1 was originally reserved for GPD. They say 54-1 currently reserved for use by DPW, who's instead using 7054-4 for bus operations, although it was, so the back of 7054 was originally reserved for GPD. So CLTC foreseeably might end up with the back portion of 7054-4, which may be not usable for any of their purposes. And DPW, no, and GPD, I'm sorry, DPW might still end up with 7054-1, which is, okay, part of the original, a different bill. I would also like to raise a concern that we are rezoning this property from agriculture to M1. I would like to ask the sponsor, in the original bill before it was substituted, it said M1/PF, but this one only says M1. Is there a reason for that? I guess, is that okay? And I didn't hear from GPD, so perhaps I'm going to ask the sponsor if he would yield. If GPD requires M1 for an evidentiary facility, or do they require an M1 for this impound lot that they might build?
They within the M1 zoning parameters, you are allowed in their public facilities. And so certainly the evidentiary lockup is a public facility. So we just left it at M1, and I believe it's mentioned in their rezone to, it's rezoned to M1.
M1. For a public facility.
Where did you see that?
Page 3, line 9, it's...
That's right. Light is rezoned to light industrial M1 for a public facility.
All right.
So we didn't need to put down M1/PF.
Okay, thank you. So I would like to, based on this, the difference in the property, one has frontage, one does not after we divide it up. We're talking about flat piece of property that CLTC had intended to use commercially or in whatever other purpose they are obligated to use their properties, versus property that is hilly or may not be suitable for that type of use, and the frontage versus the back portion of the property. So I would just ask that we make an amendment to this bill on page 2, line 25, where it says the location of the 3.5 acre portion shall be at the discretion of the Chief of Police, that it be at the discretion of the CLTC.
That's an amendment.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, to replace the words Chief of Police with CLTC.
Okay. On the amendment, anyone? Senator Ada.
I guess this is where we have competing interests. So on the one hand, we want to make sure that my colleague wants to make sure through her amendment that the frontage lot is reserved for commercial activities by the Chamorro Land Trust. The other competing interest is that maybe we want this Guam Police facility right up on the frontage side so that our citizens don't have to go driving around looking for where is this Guam Police facility. We want them to be able to drive up and, you know, with no shadow of a doubt, this is where the police facility is. So, you know, again, it's the competing interests. Chamorro Land Trust says that they would like to reserve the front there for commercial activities. How long have we had it? 20, 30 years? Sitting there, but that's besides the point, I guess. The fact is that which competing interests do we want to cater to? The public safety aspect of it, where we have a location that is readily visible to the general public, or to basically just set it aside for commercial properties. I'm going to go ahead. When the bill was drafted, it was drafted that it will be at the discretion of the Chief of Police. I will object, and I'll let the body decide on whether to make it at the discretion of the Chief of Police or Chamorro Land Trust.
Thank you. On the amendment, any other senator wish to be heard on the amendment? Senator Espadon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I understand the intent of the mover of this amendment. I just want to at least bring a different perspective in terms of what the Chamorro Land Trust could do or could have in terms of a benefit, even if it did give up the frontage. If we do, as the author of the bill states, you know, there's competing interests, and if it is eventually decided that that Marine Drive frontage would be the police precinct and all the auxiliary buildings that they intend to build, and we do zone it to M1, that actually puts a very practical use to the rest of the property, which may be behind this police facility, because that means that it would be much easier also to rezone the remainder of the CLTC property into an M1 zone. As far as I know, there are not that many M1 zones up north. And we know that there are, with the plans of the military realignment and the buildup up there, there probably is a big need for some M1 zone properties for industrial type of complexes to be placed up north. Those would actually be more beneficially suited not along Marine Drive frontage, but behind the Marine Drive frontage. Because normally those would be warehouses, those would be office buildings, and as such, that would be more suitable for industrial type use. So even if CLTC did not get the road frontage, just by virtue of it abutting an M1 property makes the zoning for the CLTC much easier to go into M1 as opposed to commercial. And it might be more suitable. And that's just a different perspective in that, again, all may not be lost if the police department decides they need to take and be more efficient and effective for them to be on the frontage and then have the M1 zoning on the back end. And that in itself brings a lot of value. Just wanted to add that perspective. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator Espadon. Senator Torres, did I see your hand go up? No. Any other senator wish to be heard then? Senator Ogden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I just want to share a quick observation. You know, we're debating whether, in fact, the property for a proposed police substation up north in Jugu area should be adjacent to the highway, or should we allow for the possibility of an M1 or a commercial enterprise to be able to occupy that particular land space. And I was sitting on the sideline trying to understand, Mr. Speaker, is if in fact the Guam Police Department situates a satellite facility adjacent to the highway, it not only provides for immediate access and egress and exit for all of our police officers, but Mr. Speaker, it serves as a deterrent and as a preventive mechanism to ensure that the community recognizes that their men in blue, men and women in blue, are accessible and visible. And then I weigh that with some of the comments with regards to generating revenues, whether it's a commercial enterprise or whatever business may be an option. Mr. Speaker, I stand here acknowledging that the best option would be to ensure visibility of our police officers, our men and women in blue, so that not only are they accessible, but they're visible and they serve as a deterrent to any criminal activity. So I wanted to share that observation, Mr. Speaker, because I found it interesting when we're comparing monetary gain, and this is my personal perspective. Let me qualify that statement. When we're comparing monetary gain in the use of public property versus visibility and maximizing the accessibility of our men and women in blue, I certainly would side on maximizing and serving as a deterrent to our community. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Any others on the Senator Estevez?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to concur with the sentiments of the retiring speaker, and also to note that when we talk about value and the benefit, to add to the benefit of the Chamorro Land Trust property that's adjacent to the lots, it's commonly known that being in close proximity to any type of police or public safety facility, not inclusive of Department of Corrections, typically increases the land value. Furthermore, to concur with the sentiments through personal experience, of the other retiring speaker, M1 zone properties, especially as where they are at much higher values than even commercial properties. And if the good senator, the author of this bill, would yield to a question, really,
Please,
the
pose the
amendment
question. No, you pose the
regarding the
question
bill?
to me, and then I'll ask if you'll answer it.
Sorry, say again.
Pose the question to the chair, and we'll ask it.
And the question is, to reiterate, because it is to my understanding that if it is zoned up as an M1 light industrial facility, then that's also inclusive of commercial activities too. So it wouldn't restrict commercial leasing or commercial usage of the property.
Sponsor wish to yield.
First of all, I think if we refer to page 3, section 5, it says there specifically that the 3.5 acre portion of lot 7054 is to be placed, that's to be placed under the jurisdiction of GPD, is hereby rezoned from zone A to light industrial. It does not rezone the entire 12 acres. So whatever is left then, it belongs to Chamorro Land Trust, and if they want to use that remaining 8.5 acres for a commercial, then they would have to come in and get a rezoning on that.
Does that satisfy you?
Yes, thank you. And I bring that up, and again, with the mindset of looking to the future, if you were to look at the area actually surrounding and the current zonings, GPA is zoned up. The Jigo Gym being a public facility is also an M1. So with the zoning of this 3.5 acres would actually be in keeping with the area. I mean, what can seemingly be the intended purpose. With those questions and with the information provided from the other retiring speakers, even though we're speaking on the amendment, I do stand in support of the bill. Nothing further. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard on the amendment? Madam Vice Speaker, you may close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I just want to clarify again that nothing in my amendment changes anything in the bill except for who decides where the 3.5 acres is going to be cut out of. And right now, we're giving total discretion to the Chief of Police. And I was suggesting that we should give it to CLTC, who has been the entity working with this property and the entity that might end up getting shorted in this transaction. And there's nothing to prevent CLTC from giving the frontage to GPD, especially if GPD, in fact, comes up with a precinct. But for the 2 hearings that I attended, their primary purpose is to establish an evidentiary facility. The original location that they wanted the evidentiary facility to be at was next to GCC. But they just couldn't get that transaction done on time. And they're looking for land that they can get as quick as possible. In fact, in part of their testimony, they said that the first property that this legislature was trying to give them, 7054-1, the triangle lot on the top, was 2 acres. And at first they said that it was too small, and they testify because it would be able to fit just the building itself, just the evidentiary control section. What we are looking is to be able to have a portion for the processing of vehicles, so there's the need for that now. We're not in the business of impounding vehicles, but we do have to process vehicles and large items, the bigger items of evidence. And it was really only on, I would say, my questioning that asking them, why are we not using your funds that you're getting to establish this evidentiary control facility to establish a precinct, when we all know what the demand for, police presence in Jigo and these populated areas are today. So it is not at all the intent to diminish GPD's ability to function there. I just think I think that they can work it out between CLTC and GPD, and especially if it's a matter of who we give the negotiating power to and who needs it. GPD is going to get this property. They don't give up anything. CLTC may be giving up use of this entire 8 acres because of, I'm not sure what amount of it is being used by DPW. And it's, you know, going to be very difficult for CLTC to go in there and kick DPW out, I would think, right? And I actually don't understand why, in the first place, GPD, well, because DLM owns part of this. Otherwise, if it was entirely owned by CLTC, GPD could have got a license from CLTC to use part of this property also. I'm just gonna again highlight the Department of Land Management's testimony where they said that the lot was declared and designated by CLTC Resolution number 2611 for commercial use. The resolution was transmitted on this date. The Commission has not yet sought to issue a proposal to potential commercial lessees because the current user of the property has been removing their equipment from the lot in our request for them to vacate. This was under commercial use by somebody who I don't know all the facts, but I think CLTC was trying to collect from them and finally had to give them a notice to vacate the property. I'm trying to recall the use, but I know it's a commercial use of this property, maybe even storage of equipment, but so I don't think there's anything in the amendment that would take away from GPD's intended use, and I don't think there's anything that CLTC, I mean, they are establishing, they're supposed to be establishing residential areas, and they are establishing residential areas in GIGO. They know, as well as we know, the importance of GPD precincts in these areas, recreational facilities, and so I don't think that they would be unreasonable. I just think that instead of possibly taking it away from them and leaving them with nothing usable, that by giving them the opportunity to at least negotiate with GPD as to the location of the 3.5 acres, that could be done, I mean, with the help of the Department of Land Management Director, that could be done very, very simply, quickly, efficiently, and it could take care of everybody's concerns. And I don't think, I don't know. And it's particularly if we end up with simply an evidentiary facility that Marine Drive frontage is absolutely necessary for that when they were contemplating putting it next to GCC in the back of Manila. So thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would ask my colleagues to support this amendment, and thank you very much.
I'm trying to remember. Was there an objection to the amendment? There was. All right. There was an objection to the amendment. All those in favor of the amendment, please indicate by raising your hand. Amendment fails. He objected. Amendment failed. On any other senator wish to be heard on the bill? Senator Nicholas. On the oh, wait.
Mr. Speaker, on the bill, on Section 3, it requires that a land zoning report shall be included in the committee report, but I don't see that before it's placed on the session agenda. And I think these are important because these tell us, really, by the experts in our agencies, they tell us whether this intended use of this property is consistent with the property.
Just a point of information, Mr. Speaker. The land zoning consideration report was received today, so it is available, and it has been, my office has formally transmitted it to the Speaker and Committee on Rules, so it is available.
Can we just get a copy to the Vice Speaker and then we can move on? Let's take a short break to allow her to review it. Legislature's back in session. Madam Vice Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And thank you for the sponsor for the land zoning consideration report, which is required by statute that we review this prior to approving a bill that especially changes the zone from A to all the way up to M1. And this report pretty much says the opinion of the Director of Land Management, but it does not include the agency review that should have been done with a recommendation by the Application Review Committee, which is the committee that would have reviewed this if the zoning had been done by the Department of Land Management. And that is where we get the agency expertise and input on this. And I support the bill, Mr. Speaker. I definitely support. We're going to give 33.5 acres of land to GPD. I absolutely support, and I have encouraged them to try everything they can to facilitate or to expand the grant that they are getting for an evidentiary building to include a precinct, because I believe it's important, and we all do. And so I hope that they are very successful in that. And I also hope that the CLTC is able to be made whole in this transaction, because I think we are potentially taking valuable property out of their inventory, out of their ability to use as collateral or to use to obtain income, to get the surveys completed. And I just don't know, because they weren't at the hearing, and neither was the Director of Land Management. So they weren't there, and we weren't able to question them directly. So we are dealing with their letters, and we're dealing with their summary reports. But I just have to say, I think when this statute was passed, that we are going to consider the land zoning reports, which include the what are they called? The Application Review Committee full report. That's why, because we want to know what. We are the ones making decisions, and we want to be well informed, as best informed as we can absolutely be before we make, particularly land transactions on behalf of the people of Guam. So we have the report, Mr. Speaker. I think it's incomplete. I think it requires I hope that the chairman of this committee will consider discussing this with the Department of Land Management, that when the statute requires an application review committee report, that we get the full report from the agencies with their expertise. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice Speaker. Senator Snick was on the main motion. He was next, and then you can have it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in reviewing the diagram of the proposed GPD section, it looks like they will be occupying almost the entire, if not the entire road frontage along Marine Drive, and then a lot of the road frontage on that public access road that's indicated on the map. I just want to make sure, because these are proposed, but in the bill we're actually giving discretion, the location of a 3.5 acre portion, discretion to the Chief of Police. And so technically he can, at his discretion, take a contiguous 3.5 acres and kind of carve it out of any portion of that lot. And I just want to make sure that we're going to be ensuring that there is a public rights of way to whatever the remaining property is. And so I wanted to proffer an amendment on page 2, line 25, after Chief of Police. Put a comma and just add the words, with public rights of way reserved to the remaining property.
Please repeat that. I see some people writing.
A comma after Chief of Police, and add the words, with public rights of way reserved to the remaining property.
Does everybody have that amendment? I see some of them looking quizzical. Try that just one more time.
With public rights of way reserved to the remaining property.
Okay? On that amendment, any senator wish to be heard? Senator Ada.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the amendment certainly has merit to it. However, I do want to point out that just south of that portion of 7054-R5 GPD, the frontage side, there's actually, I believe that's a 40-foot right-of-way that would provide access easement into 7054-R5. So there's that access easement that's available there, and that won't be closed off unless unless my colleague is taking a look at requiring an easement, a right-of-way on the northern side between the power plant and the GPD lot. But actually, you know, there's already that 40-foot easement, a road, paved road, that actually services those two lots. So I'm just concerned that if we were to put in, you know, we certainly wouldn't want it bisecting in any way the property in front or whatever. So, but I think the language is written with public right-of-way to remaining property. That's fine, because at least then it'll ensure that you know, that property back there won't get landlocked.
Does everybody see what the sponsor is referring to? It's that gray area at the very, very top. Senator Nicholas, do you understand what the sponsor was pointing out?
I do, Mr. Speaker. The reason why I'm adding this as the actual language in the statute is that while the map shows where the proposed lots are going to be, the way the statute is written is that it says that a map designating the two portions shall be prepared, recorded, and provided by land management to the CLTC and the Chief of Police. The location of the 3.5-acre portion shall be at the discretion of the Chief of Police. So while this is proposed on the map that we have been provided, the reality is that the proposed situation of the lot could change if the police chief says he wants to carve out the entire road frontage area along Marine Drive and along where that current right-of-way would be under this proposed map. He would have the discretion statutorily to be able to do that. And so what I want to do is just add language in there that would ensure that no matter what constituted that 3.5-acre discretionary selection that the Chief of Police makes, no matter what portion he chooses, they still have to make sure there's a right-of-way going into the remaining properties. So that's why the language is that I'm adding that the location of the 3.5-acre portion shall be at the discretion of the Chief of Police, comma, with public rights of way reserved to the remaining property. So no matter what, we're guaranteeing that they're going to have access.
Is that clear to everyone, what the purpose of the amendment is? Okay. The amendment has been proffered. Any senator wish to be heard on the amendment? Any senator wish to be heard on the amendment? Senator Chilai.
Yes, I want to thank the sponsor of this amendment. This is this helps to ensure that the transaction is at least a little more fair. The more I'm thinking about it, the more unfair this transaction is looking, Mr. Speaker, because if DPW continues to use the property, we are ending up simply taking away property from the Chamorro Land Trust without giving them anything. And they are entitled to property. And they had asked that they be given a property up, you know, another property that's being reserved for DPW in exchange for, I guess, letting the DPW use this portion. But so it's a good amendment because if CLTC is able to use it, they are going absolutely they're going to need access. We're not even rezoning their portion of this property. Okay, but anyways, I rise in support of this amendment, Mr. Speaker. Sorry for getting a little distracted, but yes, I stand in support of this amendment. It helps CLTC. I think we need to help them a little more, but thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard on this St. Nicholas amendment? Was there another hand up? Any objection to the amendment? Senator, any objection to the amendment? Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just kind of wanted to close my opportunity to speak on this measure by kind of reiterating something that I said in a previous session. The land in the Chamorro Land Trust, Mr. Speaker, is an asset of the Chamorro people. And, you know, if it was privately held property that we were talking about, the conversation would be more about how much we're going to authorize GPD to enter into a lease agreement with the private property owner, and then the agency would need to actually lease the property from the private owner. Right now, the precinct, the police precinct, I know a lot of our public safety agencies are right now renting from private property owners. In this instance, what we are doing is we are taking Chamorro Land Trust property that's an undivided interest, because technically speaking, this entire 8.44 acres plus this 3.5 acres, it's all one contiguous piece of property. And it's an undivided interest that technically is 75% controlled by the Chamorro Land Trust. If we were to treat it as a true asset of the Chamorro people, then we should probably be looking at paying for the right to allow for the Chamorro Land Trust to subrogate their interest to the interest of the Guam Police Department. And that should actually have a value. Part of the reason why perhaps an appraisal is worthwhile is because if you are able to determine the value of that subrogation, then you can assess a fee for that. If we're going to be treating the Chamorro Land Trust as a land bank for the government of Guam, then I think that we need to be clear about that, because we do put property in and we do take property out. But if we are truly going to recognize it as an asset of the Chamorro people, then we need to start valuing the properties that they hold as if it was held by an entity that could monetize it for the benefit of those who are supposed to be availing of the asset. So, for example, the owners of the office building that GPD is currently renting from, they can determine what they want to put out as a fair market value for the space, and the government will decide whether or not they want to lease that space. In this instance, it's kind of reversed. We have an asset, but the government is the one who's determining how we're going to be going about utilizing that asset. And the question is, whose asset is it? Is it a government asset, or is it an asset of the Chamorro people? These are the kind of questions I think that we really need to reconcile. But if we're going to do that, we're going to have to do it from the perspective of, you know what? The Chamorro Land Trust is an asset of the Chamorro people, which means that going forward, any utilization of that property should be done in a manner that would be done as if it was privately held. However, that also means that we're also not going to be dumping any excess lands back into there. We should probably create a separate land bank, excess lands go into there, and then from there we can determine if there's any kind of transactional basis from which we can put it back into the trust. So I'm of the opinion that at this juncture the land trust should be being regarded more as an asset of the Chamorro people, and from there, if the government wants to avail of it, just like if any other commercial interest wants to avail of it, or if any other private interest wants to avail of it, then they would have to pay fair market value for it. But that being said, I am grateful for my colleagues for supporting at least this amendment that we placed in here, because absent us taking that next step, and really defining how the Chamorro Land Trust is going to be regarding its holdings. Absent that, we at the very least need to make sure that whatever interest they do originally have available, which is this 8.44 acres, is still going to be something that they can effectively utilize, and allowing for a public right-of-way, no matter what portion of the property is used for the police precinct or the evidentiary unit or whatever, ensuring that there's a right-of-way is at least going to make sure that property can still be used. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. On the main motion, Senator Esteves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise with some concern. In the current bill, what we're trying to effectuate through statute is rezone a portion of the property. And I guess my concern is that leaves us with putting into law something that's really unknown. Which portion and which lot? I believe that the process really should be to subdivide the lot first, because if they're going to be two different zonings, then they should be two separate lots. But in my experience, I've never heard, aside from a conditional use, I've never heard of one single lot having two different simultaneous zonings. And I'd like to ask if as a point of inquiry, if the sponsor and author of the legislation would be able to enlighten me as to if that's something that's possible or something that exists in another area or another lot on the island.
Sponsor wish to yield.
At least based on what I've seen in the past, it's certainly very possible to have two adjoining lots have different zoning designations on it. I think probably what you're getting at is if we're going to rezone one piece of this property as M1, we might as well rezone the entire 12 acres. And I would have concern with that simply because at least with the 3.5 acres that we're carving out for GPD, we know, and rezoning it to M1, we know what's going to go in there. We know that it's going to be an evidentiary locker, it's going to be a public facility, and whatnot. If we're going to rezone the remaining 8.5 acres, which is bounded, surrounded by residential areas, and that you'll see that swath of green right to the east of all this activity in here, that's Chamorro Land Trust properties. Now, we don't know whether they're going to put residential subdivisions in there. And so it may be that then to rezone this now with no idea what industrial activity is going to go in there may be more detrimental to what's going on with all these other residential areas here. So I don't think it's problematic that if we were to carve out, let's say, the frontage, 3.5 acres as industrial and leave the other one as agriculture, and we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. I think that may be the more prudent way to go. Thank you.
Senator Esteves, is that satisfactory?
It does, Mr. Speaker. And while I acknowledge the sentiments of the retiring speaker, as I have now here in front of me, it is the intention of the Chamorro Land Trust Commission to use the designated property for commercial use. And it would just seem that an M1 would be more indicative of the intention of the Chamorro Land Trust based on the conclusions and recommendations for said lot. But again, my question was, is it possible for a single lot to have a dual purpose and have multiple zonings within it? And he did answer my question, and thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Senator. Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion? On the...
No, I've been heard already, Mr. Speaker, but I just have a couple points of inquiry, if I may just inquire of the sponsor two small items.
Go ahead.
One is, what is GPD indicated that they were going to get $1 million some for building of the evidentiary facility, but do you know the amount of the current lease that they pay for their current evidentiary facility?
I believe no, I don't know what they are paying, if they are paying anything. I know that they were, the last evidentiary facility that they were using was up at Tizan. Those were basically, I guess until they returned it to the private, and I don't know what they were charging. I don't know.
No, I'm sure I confirmed at the hearing that they were leasing a facility, and I just don't know the amount. I forgot to ask, but okay, I just wanted to know if we knew that. All right, thank you. Did the sponsor know the plans of DPW in regards to the bus depot?
No, in fact, I know that, I think it was just last year or the year before, DPW had actually invested like a couple of $100,000 for their bus, where the bus drivers can go and congregate and whatnot. That's the facility right behind the Jigo gym. And actually that was the area that was originally set aside for the Guam Police Department's facility, which was larger than the 2 acres that by default they got left with. But no, I think DPW is there to stay.
Thank you. Any other senator wish to be heard on the main motion? If not, you may close.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate all the discussion, and I would like to just close with three points. First of all, the concern was raised that when the legislature is doing legislative rezoning, which the law allows for, the law also requires that a land zoning consideration report be provided. And the land zoning consideration, which was provided here, albeit we got it just today, but the land zoning consideration report is really an expedited version of your application review committee. So, the agencies that feel that they have something to say would certainly provide input. Otherwise, land management, would provide whatever is available. So there is some input, some feedback from the agencies that have expertise in these matters. The second thing is that we've had discussion about, who should get frontage, CLTC or GPD. And I think another way of looking at that is that if you take a look directly to the east of where this activity is, where the proposed GPD property is, and the GPD original site on the northern side there, the triangle, right contiguous to that is Chamorro Land Trust property. And so certainly down in that area in 7054-R5, if CLTC was to get the backside of that, so you draw a line, and that now becomes contiguous to the undeveloped, the virgin land back there that belongs to Chamorro Land Trust, and that becomes now one big piece. If we were to put GPD somewhere there in between, with a little bit of CLTC property in the front and GPD in the middle, and so that kind of breaks things up and kind of reduces the benefit or the value of all that property. So I think we need to also take a look at it, so by shifting these things around, like up north there, if you just draw a line directly northeast from where that is, it ties in to the Chamorro Land Trust property that can then be used for commercial purposes or whatever. The question was asked, so what do we do with that up on the north side there, it says the GPD original site, lot 7054. Again, you know, it makes, well, we could introduce a bill that specifically puts that property into the Chamorro Land Trust inventory. But even if we don't, it'll go back to the Chamorro Land Trust inventory, because the Chamorro Land Trust law says that if the government no longer needs that property that it was reserved for, which was reserved for a, in this case, it was originally reserved for DPW. But at any rate, that requirement will go away, and so that property would automatically go to the Chamorro Land Trust inventory. It would be a lot cleaner if a bill was introduced that said that lot, 7054-1, goes into the Chamorro Land Trust inventory. And finally, the final point that I want to make is that a question was raised about the status of that property, 7054-R5, in that there was actually a commercial activity that was in there. It was International Bridge Corporation. Prior to this property does not, according to the Department of Land Management Director, this property does not currently have an active Chamorro Land Trust Commission license or lease agreement. The lot, however, was being used by IBC Construction Company via verbal authorization predating 2014. They have since been instructed to vacate the land in preparation for its commercial use by CLTC and are approximately 95% complete in their removal of all equipment and debris from this lot. Signed, Michael J. Borja, Director, Department of Land Management. So I think that that answers the question of, you know, is there somebody in there that we're going to need to evict? And the fact is, the answer to that is no. So, colleagues, I ask for your favorable consideration of Bill 105. I think a lot of thought has been put into it so that nobody comes out a loser, and that everybody, both GPD and the Chamorro Land Trust, will come out a winner in this transaction. Thank you very much.
On the motion to send the bill down to the voting file, any objection? It's 4:30. Let's recess until 9 tomorrow morning. We have several bills. It took us 5 hours to get through this one. We're in recess.